Welcome to the latest episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks. I'm Imogen Saunders, Associate Professor at the ANU School of Law and Director of the Centre for International and Public Law. Today we are discussing an issue never far from the mind of all academics, publication. And in particular, the Holy Grail, beloved by Associate Deans Research and metric compilation services the world over, publication in peer-reviewed journals. We are lucky enough to have three experts here today in the form of general or editors-in-chief of law journals to share their experiences, reflections, do's, and perhaps more importantly, do-nots. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Ingrid Brunk from Vanderbilt University and co-editor-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law, Professor Liz Fisher from Oxford University, who has just stepped down as General Editor of the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies, and Professor Jolyon Ford from the Australian National University and General Editor of the Australian Yearbook of International Law. But before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff, without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. Before we get down to the ins and outs of publications, our traditional first question. Ingrid, Liz and Jo, what's your drink today?
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast to be here. I've been a fan for a long time. Even though it's late afternoon in Nashville, Tennessee, I am drinking an espresso sourced from a Memphis organization called Coffee Black that has created an all-black coffee purchasing and roasting system. And I am drinking it in a Viennese porcelain mug, allowing me to think a lot about colonialism and post-colonialism.
I can't follow that. I'm sitting here. This is Liz Fisher. I'm sitting here with a mug of herbal tea because it's our final week of term here, and I have been doing lots of marking.
Hi, and thanks for having me. I'm Jolyon Ford. It's before 9 in the morning for you and I, Imogen, as we record this. So I have a smoothie. Do you want to know what's in the smoothie? There's
Absolutely.
Banana, some kind of protein powder, peanut butter, blueberries, and strawberries. And with the strawberries, I just stick them straight in. I don't take the green parts off because, it all gets blended.
Controversial.
Yeah.
Well, I also have a coffee because, as Jo says, it's early. The coffee itself isn't interesting, but I thought the mug might be. I'm going to hold it up, but also describe it. It's a COVID-era mug from when we were all talking about how long to wash our hands for. But this one was printed by a colleague of mine when we taught the international law course together. And it is how to wash your hands to Article 38(1) of the Statute of the International Court of Justice. And if you read that out, say that out loud as you wash your hands, you will have washed them for long enough.
Outstanding.
That's outstanding. Yeah, that can't be beaten.
You can't beat that.
So for our first question, before we get into the publication side of things, we do have a lot of students, early career researchers, and other people who might be considering a career in academia or international law who listen to the podcast. The three of you have had wonderful careers and will continue to do so, and are now editing world-leading journals. But I was wondering if you could share with us how you first got interested in a career in law and legal academia. And do you have any suggestions for those just starting out, or things maybe to avoid?
Yeah, this is Ingrid. I hesitate in a way to answer this question because I really do think I kind of did it all wrong. In the States, we do an undergraduate degree, which I did in European history and German. And, then you choose a professional track or you go off and do business. And I went to law school, honestly, without really any clear idea of what lawyers did. I didn't have any in my family, and it just sounded kind of like something that would appeal to me. This is a very bad reason to go to law school. But it worked out really actually well for me. And I followed what interested me in law school, and I continue to do that as a scholar. And it's not the best working paradigm, but it's one to think about. And it's in some ways it's served me really well to just keep pushing on the questions and ideas that are really compelling to you personally. And sometimes that takes you in unconventional directions, which I think can be difficult at the beginning of your career, but then really pays some dividends later on. So that's my hot take.
I don't think there's probably a right way to become an academic, but I think there are probably three things you've got to really, really love. The first is teaching and communication, because that's what we really do, whether we're writing, whether we're in the classroom. The second, I think, is community building. And when we come to journals, a journal is really a community. It's not just a place to publish. It's curating. It's editing is about helping authors publish the best work that they can bring. And then finally, it's about doing a lot of reading and writing, and enjoying that, and realizing, I mean, I love writing. It is so difficult to write well, and it's kind of being in there for the long haul, working on a project. Sorry, I don't think that's probably a very optimistic or sort of selling academia, but I utterly love it.
I love it too. So to answer your question, Imogen, I guess if I could look backwards, what advice I would give to me rather than to everyone else out there, because everyone's different. But for me, I guess in retrospect, I sort of went after lots of different shiny things that were interesting to me. Whereas I can imagine that it would be good advice to kind of stick with something, usually something around your PhD topic, either pre-PhD or post-PhD, and just consolidate a certain level of reputation and confidence and so on in publishing terms. And for my part, as an early career academic, I just bounced around a lot, which meant I've done a lot of interesting things, but I sort of struggled with that elevator conversation. What's your thing? What's your stamp on things? Because I had sort of spread myself too thin. So that would probably be the advice I'd give to my younger career self, was to just sort of stick with something. Obviously, over time as an academic, you get bored of certain things, or you find other things interesting, or you find connections between things. But that was in my case. But yeah, the other thing is that I left academia for 11 years and then came back, and that was a risk. So I think one of the hard things, at least that I find here in Australia for our law academics to navigate, is the mixed messages they get, right? So you get all this message of how you need to, engage with government and industry and have policy ready insights and all that sort of stuff, which suggests, go out there and do all sorts of non-publishing things. But at the end of the day, appointment panels and promotion panels, they just want to see the publications to some extent. So there's a bit of a misalignment between that. And that's something for early career academics or people getting into academia, for your question, to think about how they position themselves in those competing sort of narratives.
Yeah. And Joe, I think it's interesting because I also bounced around a lot in my career, at the beginning of my career, always in the field of international law, but just essentially whatever interested me, I wrote on. And I think one of the things we found, we asked this question a lot on the podcast, and one thread that comes up a lot is people saying what I was doing didn't really make sense at the time, but it does make sense in retrospect. And what I'm finding now, I'm in the nice position where all that bouncing around I did, it is actually converging into projects.
I think of it as like following if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, following the pole star. Each person has a kind of intellectual pole star. Or if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, the Southern Cross. And it's less bouncing around, but taking kind of different trajectories where you're getting closer to the intellectual themes that really animate your work. And for different people, it's different things.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think there is value in finding an identity. It makes it easier to sell your story and tell people what you're doing. But I do think there's also value in having that intellectual curiosity and being open to things that excite you as you go. Okay, so my next question is going specifically to the journals that you all edit. You are, of course, editors of quite different journals. Ingrid, I'll start with you. The American Journal of International Law is considered by many people to be the top international law journal in the world. Is there a pressure that comes being an editor of that journal with that reputation?
I think there's a pressure I think that would be a fair way to say it. It's also, of course, an absolute privilege to hold that position and to be able to review the quality of manuscripts that we do. So I view it more as a privilege than a pressure. But I think the way I experience it as a pressure right now is I think our field, and my vantage point, of course, is the United States, but it feels like the field is in some disarray. And again, that might be because of the country and the political situation in which I'm sitting. It does feel in the field as a whole that we're more in a moment of taking things apart and taking them down than we are in building things up and creating them. And it's a little bit hard to gauge, at least for me, the manuscripts or even the methodologies that are really going to hold tension over, a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. And I feel like methodologically, a number of new methodologies have kind of, I don't want to say run their course, but are less new than they were, right? You have a new methodology and it's really exciting to analyze a bunch of problems with your new methodology, or you're creating new international institutions, or you're drafting new treaties, or you're solving new problems. And of course, the world is doing that. I don't want to overstate this, but again, especially from where I sit, it feels like we're in a moment where there's more stasis and there's more decay and there's more destruction. And I think that makes it really hard to pick articles that are really going to have a staying power. It also makes it hard to write them. It's not just about picking them, right? I think it's a hard time in our field to do generalist sort of field-wide research that feels both like exciting and new. So I think it's a difficult space, I think, as an editor, but it's just also a difficult space for all of us, I think, as scholars and authors. I'm not sure if folks share that, but that's something I feel as a pressure in this role.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess I never thought about that idea of the Ford prediction, picking what articles will last and perhaps leave a legacy and an imprint as being one of the considerations. And of course, we all know there are articles that probably no one at the time thought. I'm sure there are some that everyone read and went, oh, this is going to be amazing. And there are some that no one thought. And 30 years later,
Exactly.
40 years later,
they wind up being prescient in a way that no one predicted. It's true. I do feel like this is part of my job, is to, and at least in theory, the stuff that we publish, then that all of us publish, then goes on to shape the field. And so it's an interactive process as well, right? What ideas do I want to have out there as leading ideas in the field? So I think that makes it difficult.
And Jo, then the Australian Yearbook of International Law has to walk a tightrope between, on the one hand, having a distinct national identity, but on the other being globally relevant. As general editor, how do you navigate this challenge?
Well, you've nailed it really there, and I'm quite new to the role too. So I navigate it mostly by trying to follow those who went before me, who were very, very good. Esme Sherlow, Don Rothwell, and others who have been, what's the word, custodians, I guess, of this. It's a sort of yearbook of, it's a journal of record in some ways. So it always contains, a lot of Australian state practice, for example. It's a very big part of the yearbook. And just in practical terms, putting each edition together, collating all of that, essentially sort of record of state practice or what have you, it's a very big part. And we'd like to think it's a very big value in the product, so to speak. But yeah, it's difficult because we have an Australian identity. Australian international lawyers, as we know from this panel itself, they're all over the world. They punch above their weight, so to speak, on the international scene. And so Australia is an interesting place for international law. And we'd like to think that an Australian perspective on international law is not just of interest or relevance to Australians. So but yeah, the balance we try to strike, I guess, is that we are looking for pieces that are of relevance to Australia and Australian perspectives on international law, even if they're not about Australian perspectives on international law, if that makes sense. So we do receive quite a few submissions, which in my own view have no connection with the yearbook as a publication. And the balance that, we've sort of adverted to there, because our journal takes quite a while to go through, it's an annual journal, and it's not really, well, I don't see it as general editor as a place to put pieces that are, trying to deal with very current issues. And a lot of, maybe this is of interest to the listeners, a lot of journal pieces are trying to, and understandably, they're trying to engage with the issues of the day, drones and targeting in Ukraine or whatever it happens to be, which is all very interesting and important. But what we try and think about, it's actually already been touched on by Ingrid there, is it what's going to stand the test of time just until the publication date, which may be 8 or 10 months away if the article's received right at the beginning of our cycle. But to stand the test of time more generally. So as a journal, as an editorial approach, it's a very zoomed out approach. It's like, what is the thematic issue here that either doesn't appear to have relevance to, Australia, or appears to simply be, an Australian perspective, but is actually thematically going to endure or be of relevance going forward. So that's sort of the overall approach that we take. But your question really nailed it, the difficulty as a yearbook, the sort of national repository of international law perspectives. And of course, the other editors will probably jump in and agree with this. Sometimes you get a piece that you think, well, this is not really our journal, but it's so good. Do you want to pass up on it? And should you put it into the publication just because of its quality, its relevance? And I was going to say its timeliness, but that's less of a consideration really for the yearbook. We're not trying to be the most responsive journal that's sort of dealing with cutting edge things, especially these days where there are blogs and sort of micro forums and other things where people can put those kinds of products out. We would think of the published formal journal article as more zoomed out, like, what are you saying that is connecting to enduring themes and how those themes are changing, or new themes, rather than just sort of responding to the issues of the day.
Yeah, and we'll return a little later in the podcast to contemporary issues, but I think that's a really interesting point, the difference between a journal that publishes once a year and a journal that might publish multiple times a year, and how that affects the articles.
So the OJLS is a generalist journal, and its aim is to publish pieces that stand the test of time for an academic audience. So it's not like some generalist journals, which are also trying to write to practitioners. And that makes it very different. Now, one of the aspects of legal scholarship, and long may it last, unlike other disciplines, we're incredibly methodologically diverse, not just subject matter diverse, but methodologically, and also in terms of different jurisdictions. And so what that means as an editor is one is really trying to keep an open mind. When I first sort of started taking up editing years ago, it was on the Modern Law Review editorial committee. And I thought, I'll sit down and I'm going to read that journal from its first issue right through to sort of when I had kind of taken it up. And going back to Ingrid's point, what really fascinated me was the way certain articles, over 50 years, they still sparkled with something really exciting. And then there were also examples of people who had maybe published several articles in the space of a few years and then they'd kind of disappeared. So, I think, again, it's remembering that, this process of journals and curating, there is always a bit of risk and luck in it. Anyway, but yes, we should get on to what I suspect people really want to know, which is advice about submitting to journals. But I saw Ingrid putting up her hand. I don't know if she wanted to say something.
No, I was just waving in agreement. So no, let's get to what people want to hear, which I expect also is how to get published in various outlets.
Absolutely. So, you've both done my job for me. Let's go ahead. What does to you, all three of you, make a submission immediately stand out as high quality or compelling when you see it?
Yeah, shall I start? So the OJLS has about a 9% acceptance rate. And that means that most of what gets submitted to it will be rejected. Now, a good chunk of that will be stuff where there are issues to do with quality. But there will also be some stuff, and this really goes to Joe's point, where it's about the wrong fit. And what the wrong fit means, people sort of think that's a judge of quality. It's not. It's about thinking about who is your audience. So, for example, I work in the space of administrative law. If I was to submit to Ingrid's journal in international law, that is that's an obvious kind of wrong fit. But I think it's when people are writing an article, the first and the most important thing is for people to think about is who are their audience? Who are they wanting to write to? Is it academics? Is it actually to a very specific group? I've often made the mistake in my own work who I've actually got the audience kind of wrong. Is it to practitioners? So part of quality is knowing who your audience is. The second part of quality is having a line of analysis through a piece. If you're kind of reading a piece and everything that is accepted by us will go through peer review, so it's never just an editor's decision. It's that actually, there is a flow in the analysis, that the bringing in of description relates to that flow. And that sounds easy. It is always more difficult to achieve that, as all of us know in writing. And then the third thing is a kind of fidelity to material, and really being able to work with legal material, not just kind of dumping kind of legal description in. And fourthly, we talk about originality. I'm always a little bit skeptical about originality in law, because we are working, what really matters is we do have fidelity to material. But the Japanese novelist Murakami describes originality as fresh, energetic, and distinctly your own voice. And again, I think, a piece that has quality does have that. So I'll throw all that into the mix, and other people may disagree with me.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite hard to follow. There's so much in there. Luckily, it being a podcast, people can kind of pause here and go back and listen to it again and then omit mine. I guess, so the question was, what is it we're looking for?
Both what is it you're looking for, but also what makes something stand out when you see it? You think this is a really good submission?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's a sense straight away that it's trying to sort of move the needle on the literature rather than sort of fall between the sort of academic and the policy sort of insights type submission. So we do tend to receive quite a lot. I mean, international law has a lot to do with, obviously, with other actors that are not academics. So, but some of the submissions maybe get that balance a little bit to the side of the non-academic. And so what we're looking for is a sense that this person is taking the literature from one place where they found it and moving it on, even if it's ever so slightly, and being quite clear about how they're doing that, as opposed to sort of the idea that this piece has just sort of arrived in splendid isolation from everything else. So that, for me, is something that I look for straight away, is to what extent is from the face of it up front, is there a sense that this person has really made a considered sort of addition or caveat or whatever it happens to be to the existing, I guess, state of knowledge, which sounds sort of like an assessment criteria almost, right? But maybe it is. Maybe that's the approach I take to it.
I agree with what others have said here. I see no point of disagreement. So I'll try to add maybe a little bit. The American Journal of International Law, we publish articles up to 30,000 words in length. That is really long. Right? A 25,000 word, 28,000 word article is extremely long. We also publish things that are shorter, the whole range. There's no, right? We publish things that are 8,000 words, 15,000, but we are known in the field for publishing these large kind of hopefully field defining pieces that we sometimes succeed at doing, and sometimes I'm not sure we succeed. But it really, I think it puts a premium on not just the things that have already been mentioned, but we are looking for, a clear, really pretty significant thesis that is well articulated, as Liz said, with an understanding of who might read and respond to this, which is another way of making Joe's point about situating it in the literature, or the field generally. And then, organizing a piece this long is actually, and pulling, as Liz said, the argument and the narrative thread all the way through to the end is really challenging to do that well. And if I actually had one wish for pieces with a really good idea that are really working hard to do something, there's just a number of pieces I wish the author had just spent a little bit more time before they submitted. Like playing through the examples, like, okay, you've got a new theory. That's great. Like, so give me, but your examples that are on page 53, like, whoa, they don't really cash out. Like, and maybe no one will notice that because it's so long, right? But it's hard. And I think understanding how long it's going to take to write a piece like that, and how much you should try to workshop it, or that's not true of everyone, but it's true of most of us mortals here on Earth. And that's going to go through a lot of workshopping. So I guess we have declined a few pieces that I felt like, had the author really worked more at the pre-submission stage, they might really have gotten over the hump. And that's painful as an editor. And you can try to rescue it through the revise and resubmit and the comments, but that has costs, and it doesn't always work out the way authors might. If you're an author and you think, wow, this great piece, I know it's great, and I'm just going to submit it, and we'll work all the kinks and the revise and resubmit. I think that's probably not the right way to lead, right? Really try to have your ducks in order, and it'll probably still get changed through the revise and resubmit. But you need to have a really strong handle on every piece of the argument. This
is such an important point. Like as editors, we don't want the sense that the person knows that it's a bit undercooked, but thinks, let me just put it in anyway and see what I get back. And, that might even improve my argument, see what the reviewers say. Like what I guess people submitting, if they haven't sat in an editorial capacity before, don't appreciate how difficult it is to find reviewers who are quality reviewers, who are going to get the thing back within a decent period of time. And so if it's evident from the piece that the person's sort of not a fishing expedition, but sort of, they could tighten it more, but they think, let me just put it in and see. That's not that appealing for us, even though, sometimes it's hard because, as Ingrid just said, you can see it's, this piece has huge amount of potential, but, we're human beings, and part of us is like, oh God, can I really see us going through the months of what it's going to take to, to put it where it needs to be? And of course we have a, proper process for that, the revise and resubmit process, and the reviewers can always say that. But, this is especially true for our listeners who are new to the game. You want your editor to pass it very quickly on to the reviewers because they've had a cursory look and they've thought, this is worth reviewing, rather than catching with the editor in that sense. So any bit of effort just to tighten it is not going to be wasted. If you're serious about publication with that journal.
Can I just come in and defend authors a little bit? Because I think there is a huge pressure, and I think it probably differs in the US than it does from, for example, in Australia, the UK, and other places. I think the pressure on academic authors to submit before things are ready is significant. And often authors don't always have the support in their institutions of getting feedback on work. And particularly if you're a junior author, sometimes actually asking people to go through your work carefully for you can be quite challenging. So in a sense, I'm agreeing with you. But I think it is, in a sense, if anyone is listening who's in a, running a law school, is saying how one supports authors early on. So that's my first point. My second point is, I agree, you see things which have incredible potential, but which are rejected because they're not, there are issues. And of course, sometimes they are the most exciting pieces of work. So it's also this other thing.
100%. You've nailed the hardest part of being an editor, I think, Liz. 100% agree.
And in a way, one of the other things I would want to say to people is, just because a piece gets rejected doesn't mean that is the end of the road for that piece. Whatever feedback comes back, take a while to reflect, and it always takes a while to kind of digest it. But there is a thing that, if you are trying to do something really interesting and really different, it is not going to work the first time, and it may not work the third time, but it may work the fourth time.
So my next question actually draws on a bit from your answers here, because one of the things, you've all said is what not to do is to go in undercooked, as it were. But are there any other things that are don'ts on your list, or things that make an article very easy to reject?
Don't plagiarize. And I can know, so quite seriously, the OJLS, everything goes through plagiarism checking, and I suspect that is the case in other journals. The use of AI needs to be disclosed, and being very careful, because that can quickly affect the quality of the piece. In a sense, also don't, in a sense, I think people sometimes just think, well, if I assemble things, or if I try and, so the other mistake is where people take, for example, a bit of their doctoral thesis and kind of try and chop it out, but it is still very obvious that it is part of a bigger part. The other thing is, don't try and write a book in 15,000 words, which is the word limit for an OJLS article. So I mean, all of it is kind of learning about the space that you have to write in, and writing to quality.
Jo or Ingrid?
I think Liz has covered a lot of the base as well. Even in a piece that's well cooked and well vetted and careful, just really have a tight handle on your thesis. Don't let it sound a little different in the conclusion than it sounded in the introduction, right? It sounds minor, but just sort of texture, keeping the texture of the argument, even in a very well done piece. And some of that can be hashed out in the editing process, but really keep a hold of that thesis, and the methodologies you need to show the thing that you say that you are showing, right? Mm-hmm. And to my mind, the methodology needs to follow the thing that you're trying. There's all kinds of different arguments and try to present, and some of them need different methodologies. And so if your thesis is empirical, and your work doesn't have anything empirical in it, then, structure the thesis. It may still be a great thesis. It may be largely doctrinal, or it may sound, but just be really thoughtful about those things.
I find in my writing, sometimes what I set out to write doesn't actually end up being what I do write. So sometimes that's just the editing process, right?
Mm-hmm. Agree.
So my next question touches on some things that have come up already. There is a apocryphal curse, "May you live in interesting times." I say apocryphal because it's variously reported to be a translation of an ancient Chinese curse, but most likely was first said by Sir Austen Chamberlain in 1936. Now, hopefully the times we are living in will not mirror the years following 1936, but nonetheless we are dealing with numerous global challenges. I was wondering what your approach is to dealing with articles that address very contemporary and ongoing events, some of which are not resolved and may not be resolved for a very long time, and some of which also elicit substantial controversy.
Well, controversy is not problematic at all, to my mind. There's controversial topics and there's controversial takes on topics that are not themselves controversial necessarily. But the role of an editor is not, we're not the editor of another kind of output or publication or, medium where you're trying to generate interest and so on. So I wouldn't think it's part of my role to look for something or to deliberately look for contrarian stuff just for the sake of generating that debate. But yeah, I mean, I would have thought that, it's the balance we've already talked about, that we do want pieces that are trying to engage with a critical perspective with what's going on in the world around us. And especially for the yearbook, we're not trying to provide for our readership, because our readership is not just, the people who read the journals or say they'll read the journals to themselves as they come out. But, as our very first discussion covered, in 10 years' time, when a student takes it down from the shelf and wants to write about islands in the international law or whatever it happens to be. So, yeah, I'm less kind of inclined to be caught up as an editor in the sort of, if I'm just thinking of someone's abstract, say all we got to see was the abstract, we've got to make a call on that alone, right? Like conference submissions where you just put in an abstract. If that was our role, we don't see the whole piece, then an abstract for a piece that just, is very, very topical and trying to sort of get really into that arena of a topical issue or controversial issue wouldn't necessarily mean, okay, we should try and run with that, whatever its quality or what have you, because that's not how I see my role, and that's not how I see this product or institution.
I think this is a real challenge for the American Journal of International Law. The journal has been perceived as very American in its methodology and very sort of staid and in its editorial choices. And I think my co-editor-in-chief, Monica Hakimi, and I have worked very hard to rectify this. I think we've published a really diverse set of authors that represent a pretty diverse set of views. But your question's really excellent, as take events like Ukraine and Gaza. A lot of our content is just what comes in the door, and that doesn't necessarily assure a balanced coverage. I mean, right? We're not the New York Times, right? We're not the Guardian. We're not going out and picking the stories that we report and hiring the reporters. I mean, we have a few sections, the book review section and contemporary practice, that do that. But this can lead to very quote unquote unbalanced coverage. Why do we have more on Ukraine than we do in Gaza? Right? It's a tough challenge for, I think, for the American Journal of International Law, because we're not trying to be, covering every detail of the world as it unfolds, and yet these sort of coverage issues that appear to some to be, disproportionate are hard. We've addressed it using some curated content. So we solicited some content about international humanitarian law and Gaza. The stuff that we were getting in, wasn't approved by our referees. And so we solicited some. We did a special issue on reparations, which allowed us to profile a whole host of views on that topic. We're doing in January a solicited book review where we selected sort of classic and contemporary texts and asked people to put them in conversation. So these are ways that we're trying to get a handle on this, but it's just a difficult. I think I'm very proud of the product that we've created in one way or coverage choices that we've made. Absolutely. And in some ways, I'm excited that editor, our editor-in-chiefship is turning over in 4 years, which was our choice not to run. But it's exciting to see what new, I do think new editors will bring new perspectives and new ideas for how to address the problem that you're.
It's a really interesting one, and if I may jump in, it's not something I've actually, as in taking up this role, applied my mind really to. But just off the top of my head, I'm not sure if I would see my role as trying to ensure there's kind of diversity of coverage in the yearbook. But I need to really think about that as a general editor. I think we would go for quality first, rather than, that's what I'd like to think we're doing, quality of scholarship first, rather than let's make sure everyone's perspective is here. But that's something I need to discuss with my other editors.
So I think it does differ from journal to journal. Before I was general editor of the OJLS, I was general editor for 10 years of the Journal of Environmental Law. And we didn't do anything as dynamic as Ingrid, but we did do kind of issues and sort of special collections of pieces where we were trying to get different views and to think, for example, about different voices. But what I really wanted to say was I agree with the comments said before. And I really 3 important points. What really matters is that, a journal like the OJLS publishes scholarship. That's its strength, that's its limitation. Secondly, I think in an era, and I think it was you, Joe, who mentioned, the emphasis on impact, etc. I think sometimes it can get really confusing about what are academics doing. Is it kind of the opinion, the op-ed piece? Is it a piece of scholarship? And there are many different ways to talk about controversies, but academic journals talk about it through scholarship. And then the third thing, and this is really my own field of environmental law, one of my props is a magic wand. I think also one of the issues about when talking about contemporary issues is there can be a really strong desire to find the magic wand, which actually puts at risk the quality of the scholarship. And I understand why people want to find the magic wand. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
So I have one final substantive question for you all, and it draws on actually Ingrid's reply a bit in terms of diversity of authors and diversity of viewpoints, because our field, law and legal scholarship, is often seen as being dominated by the global north. And indeed, the journals that you all edit are positioned in the global north. That's my fault because I put this panel together. But one of the reasons I did is because they are viewed as some of the top journals in the world. So given this, I was wondering what challenges or responsibilities you feel you face in terms of supporting authors from the global south to be able to publish and have their views heard and represented as well.
It's a very important question, Imogen, and as for my last answer, I guess it's something that with my co-editors and our advisory board, we really need to sit down and think about as a sort of institutional philosophy or policy, I guess. There's a separate point, which is how to, be more inclusive and supporting more generally with that kind of scholarship, not just in the publication space in these kinds of journals. Yeah, it's a difficult one because, and again, I'm thinking aloud, but there's a balance to be struck, I guess, in some way. And that's, I would not, as an editor, want to take that sort of decision alone in terms of the balance between what premium you put on the quality of scholarship as opposed to other considerations. But yeah, it's really something to think about for sure. Yeah.
Can I just jump? Oh, Ingrid, do you want to jump in?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so just 3 very quick thoughts. I think the first, and to me, the most important thing is it's not just that scholarship is dominated by people from the global north, but that we somehow think it is more important to study some legal systems over other legal systems. And people will often say to me, nobody wants to know about this legal system. I don't believe that. I think, I'm a great believer in what I call legal parochialism. We go and, law is inherently parochial. Studying law in different places, all legal cultures are incredibly sophisticated. It's not that one legal system has a greater, is more sophisticated than another in that sense. And so I think the first and the most important is to recognize that there is so much law and so many questions in law that have been underexplored, particularly in jurisdictions where there hasn't been a group of scholars studying it. So that would be my first thing. The second thing is things are better than in an online era. It is at least better. And I'm not saying this is an answer. I'm just pointing, to an era when in actual fact, everything had to be done by post. And there are, I think, greater possibilities to think about different formats for publishing. And I think, there are so many, again, possibilities about what could a journal look like, etc. And then I think the third thing is, any piece of scholarship, wherever it is produced, whoever is producing it, it does take resources. They need materials to work with. They need the time. They need to learn from their mistake. I need to learn from my mistakes when I'm writing. And thinking about, it is never a case of clicking the fingers or doing an all-nighter. And I think that's not just for people from the global south. I think that's everyone. I think it can be very easy to underestimate how much time and how much work and how many tears, at least for my part, goes into producing a piece of work.
I think that's right. I think there's a little bit of sometimes I guess I feel as an editor that there's a little bit of a misnomer that there's a lot of really great scholarship written by people in developing countries or in the formerly colonized countries, and it's just there if AGIL would just accept it, and if we could just get past our institutional blinders and go ahead and accept it. I'd just like to say I don't think that's the problem. I think there are some significant systemic problems. It is extremely difficult to produce the kind of work that that our journals publish, particularly who has not received their education in English, for example. These are, as Liz said, these aren't. There is not a simple solution here, right? We publish a lot of shorter pieces from people around the world in very varying formats in our online companion called AGIL Unbound, which has been, I think, very successful at highlighting the work of a wide range of scholars, including leading scholars in the global north. So ways to try to, but I think it's a complicated problem and one we all need to keep thinking about how to address.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that point about different formats is a really good one as well, that there are different ways to get different views and voices across that journals can embrace. Well, thank you all so very much for joining me today. Wrapping up, I do have one last question. It's a tradition of the podcast that we ask one non-law related question at the end. And I'll start with Ingrid because I know she has to run off to another meeting. But our question for season 2 is, who is an underrated character from fiction that resonates with you and why?
Okay, I'm just going to riff on the question. I'm just going to tell everyone that they should read this Norwegian author called John Fosse, and he wrote this very interesting trilogy. He's the Nobel Prize winner from Norway. And it resonates with your question because the trilogy is populated by a few people who I cannot decide whether they are just the worst people I've ever encountered or whether I have some very deep-seated sympathy with them. And I think it's a very, very challenging and interesting book for that reason. Thank you all. This has been lovely. It was wonderful to meet all of you.
Thank you, Ingrid. Liz?
I found this a very hard question to think about. Okay, so I'm not going to do anything as kind of intellectual as a Nobel Prize writer. Laura from the Little House books. Oh. So as a child, I loved the little house books.
I am absolutely there with you, Liz.
And I think because actually she was someone who ultimately, and one can critique where she was coming from in her later life, and Caroline Fraser's wonderful book Prairie Fires, which contextualizes her life against sort of what was going on environmentally in the Dakotas. But she wrote about what she knew. And just coming back to thinking about scholarship, writing about what you know and writing about it plainly is, that's really powerful.
Absolutely. And you've just given me a book for my summer reading list, so thank you for that. Joe.
No, Imogen, I'm going to have to turn it back to you and ask you what yours is.
I've actually already answered this one at our when we did a live episode of Called to the Bar at the Australian and New Zealand Society of International Law Conference. But for the life of me, I can't remember what my answer was.
I'm too busy reading non-fiction as the general editor of the Australian Yearbook of International Law.
I will give you a pass for this one. Well, thank you so much for coming on Called to the Bar. It was a joy and a pleasure to speak to all of you. And this wraps up our 60th episode.